Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddy Network podcast. My guest today is Rutger Bruining from Holland. Are you in Holland or the Netherlands?
I was born there and I grew up there, but I live in London, which is where I am today.
Oh, so he's in London today. Okay. So he's a world citizen, I guess you could say. Hey, welcome, Rutger. I'm glad you're here. Tell us a little about yourself, and we'll see where our conversation will take us.
Yes, well, as we just realized, well, you just realized, I'm Dutch. I was born in Holland. It's where I grew up. I grew up in a few different cities and studied. So in Rotterdam, The Hague, Amsterdam. I studied business and economics in Holland. After that, started working as a strategy consultant at Booz Allen Hamilton. I worked in a few different industries, financial services, media, manufacturing. And what I enjoyed most in that work was working for a private equity owned company, because there was a lot more change happening than in sort of the more blue chip financial services companies where I was, writing a report which no one really knew what would happen to that. Whereas within the private equity owned company, it felt like a lot was more done into really, within the time that was there. So that was my next move in my career. I went to Columbia for my MBA, and after that, I moved to London to start a job in private equity for a sort of $4 billion US fund, working across many different industries. I worked in with companies in aerospace, energy, theme parks, diaper manufacturing. Honestly, you can name it, and it might have been there. What I didn't do was work in book publishing, which is what I started the business in. The reason I started the business had nothing to do with my professional background. It was because I regretted not recording my grandparents' stories. And at some point, I realized there were a lot of freelance writers available due to changes in the media industry. And I wanted to make it accessible to people to create a book about their life with the goal of, in the future, everyone having a book about their parents and great grandparents and great grandparents.
Um, I love that. I think it's very important. Um, it's one of my interests, serious interests. And as before we started, we were talking about my family's genealogy, and I think I can go back 10 generations on one side. Um, and then yeah, we can go back a long way. And I think because of being in America, we're much more sensitive to the immigrant history of our families. And so so I have a phrase that I use that I talk about. Most of our knowledge of history is generational memory. And it's been taught to us by our parents and our grandparents and our great grandparents and our cousins and our aunts and uncles and people who live down the street from us. That's what we really know is what history is.
Yes, and yeah, that's obviously an area which we try to help people with to make sure that that doesn't get lost across even more generations. Which not everything passes down as it should be from person to person, and I think we try to make sure people really understand where they come from. And there's also research that exists that shows that people are the more people know about where they come from, the more successful they are in life, the less ups and downs that they have in their personal life, which then creates ultimately longer term success.
So when you look at your family and you've written this down, have you published a book on your family? Is that I gather?
My father has published a book.
Oh, your father.
My aunt has published a book with us. For my grandfather, my grandparents had passed away by the time, which is why I wanted to start StoryTerrace, because I regretted that. My grandfather, we found a diary from the Second World War, which my mom took with her after he passed, without knowing it, just with stuff. And we found out about that, and then we created a book with around that as well. So yeah, I have a few different books.
And do you feel like, and I'm not asking you to kind of elevate your family's history to being definitive of the time, but do you see that we we can understand the time that of say the last century of European history through your family's experience? Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes, definitely. Yes, my family has definitely been affected, specifically in the Second World War. But then, other things go back to, um, cars being the first cars coming out. I know a story from my grandmother where she took the car of her family and she couldn't turn it back around. So she had to walk back and tell that she'd driven the car off, which, that's maybe a small thing. But yeah, in World War II, we lost family. My grandfather was in the resistance, was separated from his wife and my mother and my aunt as a result. And on my father's side, his mother was also in the resistance as a courier. His father was shot because he was a scientist with specific knowledge. So I think, yeah, those are important parts of our history as a nation, and they do come back, and I think that does probably hopefully help to keep that alive with my children as well, and to learn something from that.
Yeah, my oldest son and I are very attuned to our family's history, and my father, before he died, said that we practice ancestry worship. Not really
Well,
true.
that's only a good thing, I think. I'm not the person who has been digging lots in sort of ancestry files myself. I'm the person when someone has done that in the family, and my stepfather has done a lot of it, and then someone else. I listen intently to the stories and I ask a lot of questions, and I remember it and I find it fascinating. But I'm not the person who loves the puzzle as much on that
Right.
specific element of the sort of going through all the files and finding it. I love hearing the stories and what we know about it. I have had an ancestor who, when Japan was closed off to foreigners, he was one of four engineers that was let into the country to help them basically build better waterways, which was a sort of Dutch area of knowledge. So I love hearing those stories and knowing about those things from others.
So, is there, I mean, I'd love for you to tell stories if you want to tell stories, because I think that we here in America are very detached from the experience of most Europeans, particularly when it comes to the Second World War, because we went largely unaffected by it because it didn't really come to our shores, other than in at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And so, is there something? Is there a story to tell that you think captures, say, something about your family that you're proud of, that and you're proud not in a egotistical way, but proud in a sense of what your family contributed to your country and to your community during that time?
So my grandfather, he was a doctor, and he had a practice in a relatively rural area as a young man. It's his first practice, and he was also in the military as a reserve officer with a medical background, and so he was actually detained as part of Holland losing the war. Holland lost the war in 5 days. There was no army. The army was on bikes versus tanks. That sort of level is of, and I don't want to go. I mean, I'm not a history expert talking about why that was, but he kind of he just walked away from that, and I think everyone was released after that anyway because the war was over pretty quickly. He had worked in Germany before the war, and and he had left Germany because he wasn't allowed to treat Jewish patients anymore. They were not allowed in hospitals anymore. He was allowed to treat them. And that for him was sort of enough. I think that was 1937, something of that
Mhm.
time. And so he was very anti-Nazi from the start. And he started a small resistance group, which started at the point when men were being called up to come to a place, which basically meant they were going to be moved to Germany to work. Um, and he organized that people didn't do that. And from there, he became a leader on his island. He was from the southwest of Holland, which is sort of our islands. But they didn't do much. They were in contact because they were a very small island with few people. There were Germans there, but there was no, if something would go wrong, there'd be nowhere to go. One of the acts that they did do, and they ultimately they did some small acts where they basically took guns from Germans, so they started to build their own supply, and they were always in touch with the national resistance, which was basically headquartered in London, where the Dutch Queen was. What they did during the invasion, when the Canadians, Americans, Polish as well, British came to Holland, is that he blew up a pond. Sorry, what do you call it? A boat that goes from one place to the other and
Ferry,
back.
a
A
ferry.
ferry. Sorry, yes, I
Yeah,
couldn't think
yeah,
of the English word.
yeah.
And that was one of the only means of transportation of being able to move heavy equipment from one place to the other. So they blew that up with explosives, which was a relatively small act, which within their no, but still, of course, dangerous within that small part of the war. Probably had some impact of the Germans, finding it more difficult to move their equipment around. So I'm proud of that. And he wrote about that in his diary.
It's great. It's a great story, and it's it's an honorable story. It's something to treat him with honor for defending his land, homeland, and his family. I mean, that's the way I view that, and it's and it's not really thought of in those ways any longer, is it?
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think if you talk about why there are differences between Europeans and Americans, I do think Second World War has had a lot of impact on that, and we've seen the downside of nationalism very strongly. And I think that's also the way people think about privacy, which is also connected to the Second World War, where basically privacy or like data was being used in the worst ways. So you can see that Europeans and specifically Germans, but also Dutch, are very sensitive to those things. Whereas in America, people haven't experienced. There's the trust in the government has overall over hundreds of years been pretty high. I mean, everywhere in the world, people complain about their government. That's life, I think. Yeah, that creates different priorities in society.
Yeah, I would say that here we don't so much trust our government, but we just see it as kind of a benign entity. It's
Yes.
it's there and it's present and it creates problems, but we're not going to stand up against it. We're pretty much going to go along um, for whatever reason. We're going to kind of go along to get along, um, and
And
therefore,
that's because it moves probably within a bandwidth in
yes,
waves, whereas in Nazi Germany that went out of the bandwidth, and that created obviously the destruction of Europe.
yeah, the structure here is it's a divided system of government, so that no one actually has absolute control, unless you have parts of the government that become very corrupt, and then they seek to thwart the more, well, what would I call it, the more honest uh, actions of government. But yeah, it is a kind of a more complicated system because no one has the absolute control, and which makes the whole thought of nationalism kind of an odd issue here because nationalism can't really translate to a nationalist government because the government is divided in such a way that there's no part of it that'll ever take absolute control, even though it may appear that they're trying to. So it's a very different place. And my all my friends in Europe, um, uh, we have very interesting conversations about America and Europe and the rest of the world. So um, yeah, it's all right. We'll we all seem to figure out how to make it work. Whether it works well or not, that's another story. So so you have a publishing house that now, is that correct?
Yes, at StoryTerrace, we have created thousands of different books, most of which have been published privately. So they're just within families, which was the origin of the company to help families preserve the stories of their elders, basically. We've moved into thought leadership and business books as well because we got demand from that from basically from the start. People, can you also write a book about, you know, this topic or about my business or the history of my business? And we've professionalized that about 3 years ago by having what we call StoryTerrace Pro, where we have a top team of developmental editors, ghostwriters, book strategists, marketers, designers that work at the level of the big publishing houses yeah, for people and businesses.
So then you have relationships with agents who bringing you authors and potential books to publish. Is that correct?
No, we're basically a consumer business, so we get paid per book that we create by our clients, which in the majority of cases, people buying that for themselves. In some cases, it's businesses, and a large majority is gifts, where people give that to, say, their parents or their spouses to have a book created through us and experience, working with a ghostwriter on capturing their memoirs.
So you're a kind of a sophisticated version of a what they used to call vanity press, a more
Yes.
sophisticated where what is being published is not simply, a cheap knockoff of somebody's ideas, but a serious work of research and history or thought, and that's what you all are publishing, and that's an unusual niche, isn't it? Um,
Yeah, it's definitely unusual. I mean, the reason I started is because it wasn't really, I mean, there were some people doing it, but it wasn't done very well from my perspective. And I thought that was stopping basically more people doing this because I personally feel like anyone who has lived should, leave their story behind because it's beneficial to others, and leaving that just to sort of oral history is quite limited. It's not really necessary in today's world. So that's why I started a business, to make that accessible. And we also don't make, most of our books are not 300 pages. They're 70, 80, 90, 100 pages with photos in the family segment.
I have some books here. These are guests that have been on, uh,
Yeah,
and they've written a book, and uh, they use them to promote their business
yeah,
or promote their ideas. I've done the same. I've published 8 books. Seven I self-published with Amazon, and I use them as sort of calling cards.
yeah.
In fact, I'm waiting for the delivery of 7 cases of my first book, Circle of Impact, to arrive this afternoon. So, and and what I'm finding is that that's a growing phenomenon of people wanting to write a book. Now, these are not long books. These are relatively short, which is probably appropriate for most of the people who are going to read them. So, do you see that trend growing of average people who have never really shown themselves to be thought leaders, but now they have decided to write a book, and that moves them into a category of being thought leaders now because they've actually published something.
So keeping the sort of family memoir business
Right.
on the side, what we see in the thought leader business, these are often people who do consider themselves thought leaders, and they are in their area, and they're often public speakers,
Hmm.
or they're at the stage where in their career where they're going away from full time to different the third half of their career, and part of that is publishing a book to really set their expertise out, which also helps their speaking career or launch their speaking career or become an associate professor. And those are the most common use cases. But the general trend of well, the speaking industry is growing, first of all. So that is one driver. And I think and secondly, for a lot of C-level executives, having a personal brand is also becoming more important. They are seeing that as an investment instead of doing a 2-week executive course at Stanford in the summer, having a book created. It's an investment in their career and in themselves. So there are different drivers there.
Do you see, and I don't have an answer to this question, do you see that people like, say, a keynote speaker or a CEO who's about ready to retire, um, um, doing a recording and then giving it to an AI machine, and it writes the book for them? Is that something you see happening?
Yeah, and then so we've done a book last year for an entrepreneur, and initially he wanted to be interviewed by a ghostwriter. And then he changed his mind. He said, I'm just gonna throw it all into ChatGPT and then you guys take it over. And he paid us sort of the highest end of what we do to get the best team on it. But that was his way to download the information. And then it was our job from turning that from, a lot of good thoughts and content, but sort of written not in an engaging way for a book,
Excuse me.
into, in his case, a best-selling book.
And did it require a good bit of editing, or was it pretty much finished when it came when you?
No, no, a lot more than that. So the way we then work is we start with a strategy session after we've sort of put the team together with a content strategist, sort of what's the audience, what's the goal of the book, what are the themes, what are competing books in that category, what makes them successful or unsuccessful, what's the white space to position your book in. And then from there, we take what we know the thought leadership is of this person. In this case, it was more than just thought leadership. It was sort of a business building within sort of out of a disaster type situation, but it could be anything. And then we start using that content and saying from there, what should the outline be? What's the through line of the book? And using the content, whether that is from interviews or in this case from AI writing. But it's a rewrite more than an editing job, I would say.
That makes sense.
If you do want to do a really technical book, um, then I think it's easier to sort of do limited editing on it. But if you really want to captivate your audience, bring them inside the book, make every paragraph want the reader to go to the next, even if it's a business book, that requires, yeah, the AI can't do that today.
I'm in the middle of writing my first novel, and
Yes.
it is so different than writing a nonfiction book or business book or a leadership book.
Yeah.
And I'm about 6 months into it. I've written um, 30 short chapters, 35
Hmm.
short chapters. I plan to publish it serially, probably 3 short chapters a week. Probably it'll probably end up with somewhere between 80 and 90 chapters that way.
Where do you plan to publish it?
Uh, well, I'll get a some. I haven't decided fully, but I plan to publish it on Substack
Substack, yeah.
because they now have a way of doing that. I've
Yeah.
been writing on Substack for 4 years, so I'm
Mm.
used to it. And I'll start a new Substack page for the book
Yeah, well, that's a great place to do that in a serial form. Yeah.
and have a way, whether it's one of the vehicles for people buying the book and buying you know, the uh, the episodic nature of a serialized thing. And that I haven't figured out yet, but I have decided that I'm going to sell the whole book at the beginning. I'm going to sell, you can buy the whole book and you get a hard copy of it. And if you do that, then you're also going to get a second book. And I'm going to write a book of short stories of the characters that are in the book that are not principal characters, but are worth having a story said of them.
A bit like Cheers.
A bit like Cheers. Yes. Yes.
Nice.
Yeah, um because there's a character in the story who is a research librarian at a public library in a city in the South, and she's helping this young man deal with out of I don't want to go into all that, but what and I was talking to someone, I mean, this is a couple of months ago, and we were talking, and I said, I just don't know. I don't know where I'm going to get the answer. And then out of my mouth came this character's name. I think I'll call, and her name is Floretta. I think I'll call Floretta. And then I realized Floretta doesn't exist. She's a character in my imagination. Then I knew that I had kind of crossed some bridge, some boundary line to where this was no longer simply something I was writing. It was something I was living.
And how do you use AI for your book?
I haven't used it at all
Not at all. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
because I'm not, I don't, I'm not working from a plot. I'm working from premises. And so the premise is a 3-year-old boy, the sixth of 6 children, and he's the youngest by 6 years. So he's almost like an only child. And when he's 3 and his oldest sibling is 15, their parents die in a plane crash. And so he doesn't have an emotional attachment to his parents. He has a physical attachment to his parents. But his siblings all have this emotional because they're older, they have. And so when he turns 18 and he's off in his first semester of college, he realizes that he needs to go connect with his parents and find their presence in his life becomes more and more important to him. And so the question is, what does that mean? Because it's been 15 years since they had died, and now he's got to go, in a sense, find out what their memory is. It's probably not unlike what some of your writers of your family's diaries are experiencing. What did they go through, now 70 years ago or 40 years ago or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. It's
And
amazing though when you create the right environment, how one memory triggers another. Whereas if you ask someone in isolation to come up with all their memories, it's really hard. But if it's a process with the right environment where it doesn't feel like I need to think of something, it's just a conversation, so much more comes out and brings back memories.
so the fun part of it is writing it and coming to the end of a sentence, and the next sentence comes to you as a twist in the story that you are not prepared for. oh no, this is where it's going. And I'm not going to share that with you because I want you to be surprised. But it's that sort of thing that's so different than writing leadership books or writing kind of philosophical essays on leadership and culture and stuff like that. It's not the same at all. And so, and I have a son who's a novelist, and so he's been really helpful to me. And you know, he's written a book about the Second World War.
Oh, interesting. A
Yeah,
novel.
a novel about he's writing a series of novels about a an American farm family in the Piedmont region of North Carolina, and he's writing about this family from the 1840s to the present day. So there's
Mm.
seven or six or seven different volumes in it, and he starts with the Second World War, and the boy doesn't want to go to war, you know. He wants to stay home and farm his farm. You know, that's what he loves. And but he joins the reserves and he gets activated and he ends up spending 3.5 years in Europe. And with all the trauma that came with that bloody war, and he comes home, his girlfriend has waited for him, and he's found that the the government has required all farms to mechanize. So all these farms are now in debt to some bank or some land grant institution. And he comes home and realizes that the world that he wanted to live in is no longer exists. And he titled the book Victory Ruins.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Sounds like I forgot this is it with Brad Pitt? There's a movie,
Yeah.
not as many generations. It was a very impactful movie, but I forgot the title of it. Also with three brothers, I think, and some of them went to
Yes.
war, all of them went to
Yes,
war.
that was yes, it takes place out in the West in Montana or Wyoming or Colorado and it'll come to me. Yeah, and I think that takes place during the First World War.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll come to me. But that yeah, that's a great memory. So do you see um well let me ask you this question. Let me ask it this way. When you publish a book, what form are you using? Or what forms are you using?
So the privately published books, everyone is focused on their hardback copies. Full color, hardback, these things should be there in a century. That's and people will have a PDF because they want to store it and they want to, in case the books burn, they have the PDF. But the focus is on that, and people hand it out and they write something nice to the people they give it to. So that's our sort of family memoir part of the business. Then any book that's sort of more widely published is yeah, EPUB through Amazon, but also through all the other platforms to make them available at barnesandnobles.com for order, etc. And we tend to do hardcover, softcover, and ebook for all those published books.
Do any of the books have an audio component to it?
Some do, some do. Yeah, that's really author dependent. But it's yeah, a lot of there is yeah, it's a smaller percentage than I would have thought that does that.
Because what I could see is, say, a grandfather's written his diary, he's written his memoir, and you're publishing the memoir, but he's going to read it
Yeah.
as an audiobook, and it would have a lot of appeal. I mean, it would be appealing to me. Um, it's And I don't think we got to the point where you are early enough in our history as the West to begin to capture these stories, uh, the voice and image of these people telling their stories. I know there's a lot of that out there, but there's really not compared to the number of people who served in these wars or served during times of challenge. Um, there's just not a lot. Like my grandfather, my mother's father was born in 1886, and he practiced law for 10 years and then enlisted in the army to go fight in the First World War for the U.S., the U.S. side.
Mm.
And by the time I was old enough to understand him, he was in not very good shape. He spent the last 10 years of his life deaf and blind. So there was no communication. But I would have loved to have had him on audio tape.
Yes. I mean, we do have the interviews, and a lot of people want to download them, which they can, of course, as raw material, basically. Because for our family books, we interview usually between 6 to 10 hours, and that's a very, and there you get the raw emotion of the talking, which you wouldn't get as much if someone is reading out the book, which is also a nice thing to have. But these interviews where it gets to certain points and talking about certain things, difficult things in people's lives, or joyful moments, you get the real first emotion of because they're telling it for the first time to that interviewer.
You see, the way I see things is that those who came before us have established the experiences that we're having, and that you and I are doing the same for the generations that are yet to come. Our children, our grandchildren, our great grandchildren's generations will benefit from the stories that we're telling.
Yeah.
And and I see that as the pathway, the generational memory pathway from the past through the present into the future, and that way it's linking the generations together.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, especially when we were very early with the business. A lot of the clients they had a document or something from one of their ancestors, and that triggered them to do their own book. I remember someone very successful in the financial industry here in London, um, chairman, and he said, "Well, my grandfather, he took scribblings during World War One. He was watching for Zeppelins at the coastline, and he wrote scribblings, and those were incredibly valuable to me. So I feel a duty that I have to tell my story and write that down properly."
Do you think Europeans are more better connected to their history than, say, Americans are? You've lived here. Can you have a feel for
I
that?
think it's different. I don't think it's, I actually don't, I wouldn't, wouldn't be my inclination because I think Americans are quite well aware of where their family comes from. Um, um, I think to Europeans, it sometimes sounds like their knowledge of these different countries, then say German or Italian or whatever they are, it feels a bit high level compared to our knowledge because this is our continent and we're closer to it. I think Brits are very more in an academic way, also very interested in history. So I think actually in ancestry, Americans are potentially more interested, but history
Yeah.
is very British, that they commemorate in the way they still commemorate World War One, which no one lived through World War One alive today, is very unique. And they do that very well. And I think the way history is taught in school, the number of people that study history and then become successful in business afterwards is very high here as well. So it's more well regarded, I think. But that's very British. I don't know if that would be the same in France or in Italy or definitely not in Holland.
I I'm a big history guy, and so it's really it's not a casual interest. It's a and I wouldn't call it a passion. It's a deep feeling interest, and I like to go where the history has taken place. Like I've been to World War One sites in Eastern France and the what do they call it the Belgium and the Netherlands um, I've, and I've been through a lot of those World War One sites to kind of grasp what my grandfather experienced, but also to kind of understand that as kind of a fulcrum in time from an older ancient world to the modern world. It's kind of I see it kind of that way, and so it's to me it's interesting, and and I'm leading up to a question about the future. I was at Thiepval, you know where that is, which is
No.
it's it's a it's a it's a memorial site to those who were lost in the Battle of the Somme
Mm.
in eastern France, and they have this beautiful um, large monument, and all the soldiers that were lost in that battle, like 75,000, are inscripted on that thing, and it's an impressive place, and it's a beautiful place. And I've been there two or three times, and first time I went there, there was a group of British military pensioners there. Had been driven over on a bus on a ferry, and they brought a band with them, and the band was like a mile over in a field somewhere, and so you're hearing this military brass music. It was very moving. I came back there a couple of years later, and I was the only one there. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I went in, and there were these two young women who were working the desk, the visitors desk, and I just started asking them questions about what they saw going on in the world, and not unlike what we're talking about, and I asked them, so are you married, or are you planning to get married? And they said, "Oh no, we're not going to make." So are you even thinking about having children? I said, "Oh no." I said, "So why is that?" He said, "Well, why would we want to bring children into a world like what we have today?" And I said to them, "Because you recognize this world is not the one we want, and you would be willing, with you if you had children, you'd be willing to work to make it a better world because you would want something better for your children." And so that's kind of my question to you is do you see that this awareness of the history of your history, not just your individual history, but the history of all these families, do you see that that has an effect upon how they look at the future?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure that specific sort of mindset that you're telling about that is just down to history. I think it's down to increased individualism.
Hmm.
Probably has to do with the role of the state versus religion. Um, I mean, the sense of, I don't know, yeah, people's goals in, I don't know, goals in life, or I don't know, like maybe people are more unsettled generally. And I don't know if that's down to sort of more longer history or that's because of social media and
Well, sort of another way of framing this that I've done with my guests is, do you see this as sort of an end of time moment, or is this a transition to something new that's coming along?
Well, I certainly don't think I have the answer to that. I love debating these things. But
But you have your own perspective, and
yeah, I mean, I'm generally an optimist, I would say, um,
Mhm.
which would mean it's not the end of times because I think the world is a magnificent place. I it does feel like people are more lost and disjointed. Um, I think, and but that could also be a wave, and where
yeah,
there will revert to people finding other new different types of communities and not feeling as lost as people do in many of the Western societies today, and especially younger people. And then bigger picture of humans going to other planets, and well, that's the opposite of it being the of
yeah.
sort of
Well, I asked this because
end of times.
what I have found in this doing this podcast is that people are much more optimistic about the future than social media would dictate. And so they're what they tell me is that their hope in the future is really because of the people that they know. And and I agree with them. I'm very optimistic about the future. I don't Doesn't mean it's not going to be hard, but I think I think the future is bright. I mean, the fact that you've done this, and there's going to be this repository of family stories and family history that will show up in in 100 years. This will show up in used bookstores, and somebody will see this, and they'll take someone's story, and it will become the basis of some PhD thesis, and their story becomes something to celebrate.
That's a very nice thought. That makes me feel like I'm doing something useful. So I appreciate I
Oh,
appreciate that.
oh,
Um,
I think it's more than useful. I think it's very important. I think a culturally beneficial act on your part to find the niche, to find that niche and fill it. But I think it's really important because these stories would be lost if we didn't write them, and these stories would be lost if we didn't put them into real paperback or
yeah,
hardback books.
which is why there's this strong preference of people for about to hold that physical book. I'm having to think of something that here in the UK that joins a few of the dots actually. You were asking about history in Europe versus the US, about the wars. It's very common in school here to investigate a World War I soldier. Where did they come from? What was their story? And people write a report about it, which I think is a very powerful way to look at an individual rather than the history books that we learn and about the big waves. And I think that's very much part of sort of the culture and the interest in history here.
The literary history of the first.
No, they're just finding
Yeah,
an individual and doing research
yeah,
on that person, maybe someone from your town, not someone that you know, but as part of a school project. Students are asked to investigate one single World War I soldier. Where did they come from? What happened to them?
that's great.
And that's sort of, yeah, I think is part of maybe why, but also there, because there's an interest in history here, which is quite strong.
I've, s- you know, I, we can lament the condition of social media, but we also can celebrate it because I find stuff, and I'm sure it's my algorithm, but I find people talking about um, World War I poets all the time. I find them talking about Tolkien as in the context of the First World War. I mean,
Mhm.
and and none of that was happening when I was a child or even in college.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that the opportunities are greater now, and I'm really saying this to just encourage you to keep doing what you're doing,
Thank you.
and because I think it's really important, and so the question is, and this kind of leads to my last question is how do people if say a family has a story,
Mhm.
what is the process that they should go through that ultimately leads them into a relationship with you and your company?
Yes. I mean, they can come to our website, storyterrace.com. And what happens is when they decide to work with us on creating a book about their family or a family member, we match them with a writer based on their background. It can be their professional background, their cultural background, it can be their interests, someone they feel comfortable talking to that understands them well. They also fill out a questionnaire on our platform, because some people find it easier to talk, some people find it easier to write things up, and we tell people if you're a good talker and you don't like to write answers to the questionnaire, don't do it. Just read them so that you can start thinking, because the questions are really there to make people think before they have the interviews. Just read them, and you'll start remembering things and what's important to you. And then from there, we interview people, we create the outline for the book, they give feedback on that, we change it, we create the text, they upload their photos, they can easily drag them into the chapters, and we create the hardcover cover books.
It's fantastic. I'm thinking about how I can do that for my family. I'm not sure we can, but I have another story I'll tell after we're done. That might actually be something to pursue. Rutger, thank
Fabulous.
you for being here. I had no idea this is what we'd be talking about, but it's obviously it's something very important to me. Family history is very important to me, and to find someone who's publishing family histories is just fantastic. And I wish you well, and I hope that maybe somebody watching who has a family story that they'd like to to put into print for their family, they'll be in touch with you.
Yes, I hope so. And it was really, yeah, really interesting to have this conversation and to ask me some questions I'll probably think about later on today still. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and I thank you all for watching the Eddie Network podcast, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.